Poor girl took a beggar home out of kindness. She had no idea he was a millionaire CEO in disguise. She thought he was just another broken man sitting on the sidewalk, forgotten by the world, ignored like trash. So she gave him her last cup of soup, then walked away without asking his name. But what she didn't know was that he would remember her forever. Not for her beauty, not for her kindness, but because in the darkest moment of his life, she looked at him like he was still worth saving. And now he has everything. The suits, the empire, the power. But the only thing he wants is the girl who treated him like a person when he had nothing. The girl who looked at him. They said kindness doesn't cost a thing, but sometimes it costs everything. That morning, the sky hung heavy with gray clouds, swollen with rain that hadn't yet fallen. A breeze tugged at the corners of the city, sweeping through alleyways and subway grates, making the world feel colder than it should have in April. And down by the corner where 38th met Rosemont Avenue, a girl in a faded denim jacket stood with a brown paper bag clutched to her chest like it held all the hope she had left. She didn't notice the man sitting on the sidewalk. Or rather, she tried not to. People walked past him like he didn't exist, like his silence was contagious. He didn't ask for money. He didn't hold a sign. He just sat there, still, staring at the puddles as if they might swallow him whole. She had places to be, a shift starting in 20 minutes, rent due in 5 days, and a mother at home who hadn't left the couch in 3 weeks. She'd saved every tip from the last 2 nights to buy this meal, a single turkey sandwich and a thermos of soup. It was supposed to last the day, but something about the man's eyes caught her. Not just tired, not just hollow, haunted. She didn't think. She just crouched down, unwrapped the sandwich, and offered it without a word. He didn't take it at first. He looked up, startled, as if he hadn't been touched by a kind gesture in years. And then he smiled. It wasn't wide, it wasn't practiced, it cracked across his face like sunlight breaking through shutters that had been closed too long. "Why?" he asked, his voice low and rough. She shrugged, unsure how to answer. "You looked like you needed it more than me." Then she stood up, walked away, never looked back. She never asked his name, and she never saw his face again, not until it was plastered across a billboard 6 months later. David L. Hawthorne, the text read, CEO of Hawthorne Capital, investor, philanthropist, one of America's most eligible bachelors. It didn't make sense. That wasn't the man from the sidewalk. That wasn't the man with the quiet eyes and dirt under his fingernails. But it was, somehow. Julia sat frozen on the subway, the newspaper shaking in her hands, her world tilted on its axis. She had fed a billionaire. No, worse, she had pitied him. And now, he was everywhere. TV interviews, magazine covers, late-night news. The same man she'd given soup to now walked red carpets and rang the bell at the New York Stock Exchange. He wore $10,000 0-cent suits, drove Italian cars, was rumored to own property in the Hamptons and Paris. And yet, he hadn't said her name, hadn't looked for her, hadn't even acknowledged what happened. That moment, so small to the world, had changed her. She'd felt something shift when she handed him that sandwich, like maybe goodness still mattered. But maybe he'd just forgotten. Maybe, to him, she'd been just another face in a crowd. Until, one day, he walked into her life again, not on a sidewalk, not broken, but towering over her at the entrance to Whitestone Tower, where she was interviewing to be a junior admin. The same man. But this time, he was the one staring, and she was the one pretending not to remember. Because pride, when you've grown up with nothing, is the only thing you learn to protect. And hearts like hers, they only survive when you convince yourself that kindness doesn't mean anything to men like him. But she was wrong, because ever since that rainy afternoon on the curb, he hadn't stopped searching. Not for the girl who gave him a sandwich, but for the only person in the world who ever looked at him and saw a man worth saving. Chapter 1: The Unexpected Encounter. The sound of her sneakers tapping against the wet pavement was the only thing that broke the silence around her as Julia hurried down the crowded city streets. She pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders, trying to ignore the cold that seeped through the fabric, the chill that was becoming far too familiar. She had 15 minutes to make it to the restaurant where she worked part-time, and she was already late. Her hands were full, a crumpled resume clutched in one, a bag of bread in the other. The bread wasn't for herself. She had enough to barely get by, she always did. It was for her mom. Julia's eyes flicked to the half-empty thermos she carried from home. Her mother had barely touched her breakfast that morning. Julia's thoughts swirled, always spinning in the same direction. The future was an endless cycle of jobs, appointments, and an overwhelming fear that she was running out of time to fix things, to make everything right for her mother. As she turned the corner, her foot caught the edge of a broken sidewalk tile. She cursed under her breath, stumbling forward, the bread bag flying out of her hand, the thermos knocking against the ground. "Great," she muttered, watching as the sandwich and the thermos rolled out of reach. She bent down to pick them up, trying to steady herself. And then she saw him. At first, she thought he was just another homeless man, sitting behind a stack of discarded cardboard boxes, his clothes ragged and dirty. His hair was long and unkempt, his face unshaven, but there was something in the way he sat, something so still and almost calm that it made her pause for a moment. His eyes, dark and intense, were fixed on her, as if he had been waiting for her to trip. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice rough but steady. She didn't expect him to speak. She glanced up, startled, but found herself taken aback by how quietly he regarded her. There was a strange intensity in his gaze. It wasn't pity, it wasn't judgment, it was curiosity. Almost like he could see more of her than she was ready to show. "Yeah, I'm fine," she said, her voice a little too sharp as she straightened up, brushing off her jeans. The man stood slowly, his worn shoes making no noise against the concrete. He walked over to the thermos and handed it to her, a slight, almost imperceptible smile on his lips. "You dropped this," he said, his voice low. Julia hesitated, her fingers brushing against the metal. She blinked, suddenly aware of the disheveled man standing before her, but there was something in his eyes that made her feel seen, not for the first time in a long while. "Thanks," she muttered, taking the thermos and quickly trying to retrieve her lunch bag. "Here," he said again, holding out the sandwich. "You still have some left." She stopped. The small gesture, the act of kindness, felt heavier than it should have. There was something about him that made her want to stay, to ask more questions, but she didn't. She wasn't the kind of person who lingered in moments like this. She wasn't supposed to be caught up in the emotions of strangers. "Do you need this?" he asked softly, studying her face. "Because you seem like you've got more on your mind than lunch." Julia blinked, then swallowed hard. She couldn't help the awkward laugh that escaped her. She didn't know what to say. How could a stranger see her that clearly, without even knowing her? She forced her gaze to the ground, uncomfortable with the piercing intensity of his eyes. "Not really," she said, shrugging. I guess I don't have time for a real lunch today." He raised an eyebrow, but there was no pity in his expression. "Then I'll take it," he said. And without waiting for an answer, he unwrapped the sandwich and took a bite. She watched him, confused. He didn't look like someone who needed her leftovers. He was different, not just in appearance but in presence. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but something about him felt familiar. She shook her head, trying to push away the feeling. "Well, enjoy it, I guess," she said, offering him a small, awkward smile. As she started to walk away, she couldn't help but glance back over her shoulder. He hadn't moved. Instead, he was sitting back down against the cardboard boxes. His eyes once again turned to the world around him, his gaze calm. For a brief moment, she thought she saw something else in his eyes, a kind of quiet desperation, as if he were watching the world pass him by, knowing he had little control over anything. She exhaled softly and continued walking, but she couldn't shake the feeling that, for some reason, that moment, that small, fleeting encounter, would stay with her far longer than she wanted to admit. Chapter 2. The First Offer. The rain came down in sheets that day, the kind of downpour that made the world feel like it was washing away everything that came before. Julia hadn't meant to be late again, but she'd lost track of time, trying to juggle the endless strings of responsibility that seemed to be tied to her. The bills, the endless job applications, the constant tension with her mother. She needed a break, but that never came. The bell above the restaurant door chimed as she pushed her way inside, the familiar warmth of the diner filling her lungs. It was busy, as always, with the clatter of plates and mugs, the chatter of customers caught in small-town gossip. Julia slid into her uniform, adjusting the apron around her waist, trying to push the lingering feelings of that strange encounter with David out of her mind. She couldn't let herself think about him, not now, not when her focus needed to be on getting through another shift. The evening passed slowly. Julia's feet ached from running orders, and her smile grew more tired with each table she served. It was nearing 9 p.m. when a customer caught her attention. Not a regular, but a man she had never seen before. He was sitting in a booth near the back, with a newspaper spread out before him and a cup of black coffee in front of him. He was dressed in a well-tailored suit, his dark hair combed back neatly and his posture sharp, as if he were always in control. She couldn't help but notice how familiar he looked. His face, those dark eyes. It was him. David. Her heart skipped. For a moment, time seemed to stretch, her feet rooted to the floor as she stared at him. She blinked, trying to shake off the feeling of shock that swept over her. He hadn't noticed her yet. She could turn around, pretend she hadn't seen him, but it was too late. She didn't know what made her walk over to his table, her body moving almost on its own, but she found herself standing beside him. "Are you lost?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. David looked up, those sharp, observant eyes catching hers. A flicker of recognition passed through his gaze. He didn't say anything at first, just regarded her for a long moment, as if debating whether to speak. Then he smiled, a real smile this time, one that reached his eyes. "No," he said softly, folding the newspaper and placing it on the table. "But I suppose I've found something unexpected." Her breath caught in her throat. He was too calm, too composed, as if he had been expecting her all along. "Unexpected?" she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. David leaned back in the booth, his eyes scanning her face as if trying to figure her out. There was something guarded about him, something that felt distant, yet intimate at the same time. She was suddenly acutely aware of how disheveled she looked in her work uniform, how she felt like an imposter in a world that wasn't hers. "I didn't expect to find you here," he said, his voice a little lower now, a trace of something unspoken lingering between them. "But I'm glad I did." Julia stood there for a moment, unsure of how to respond. He wasn't the man she thought he was, and yet, in a strange way, he was. There was something more to him than the wealth he wore like armor, something that made him seem, for the first time, vulnerable. She forced a smile, trying to push the swirl of emotions aside. "Well, I'm glad you're happy with your coffee," she said, her words sounding far more professional than she felt. "Can I get you anything else?" David's gaze softened, and for a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of something else in his eyes. Recognition? Regret? Something that made her stomach twist. "Actually," he said, his voice more serious now, "there is one thing you can do for me." Her breath caught again. Was this some kind of joke? Was he playing with her? "Go on," she said, her tone cautious. "I'd like to offer you a job," he said, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her feel as if she were trapped in a story she hadn't agreed to star in. "A job?" she repeated, her heart pounding in her chest. "You don't even know me." David's lips twitched into a small, almost knowing smile. "I know enough. You've got ambition. You've got a fire inside you, Julia, and I think you'll do more than just fine. You deserve more than serving coffee and cleaning up after people who never even see you." She blinked, stunned. "Why me?" she asked, her voice trembling ever so slightly. "Because you're not like the others," he said simply, leaning forward. "You see things in a way that most people don't, and you're smarter than you give yourself credit for. You could be great if you had the right opportunity." The weight of his words hit her harder than she expected. She opened her mouth to say something, anything, but nothing came out. David's eyes softened again. "You don't have to say yes right now, but I'm offering you something that could change your life. I'm offering you the chance to take a step forward, not just for me, but for yourself." Her heart thundered in her chest as she stood there, uncertain. The thought of leaving the diner, leaving behind the only life she had ever known, terrified her. But something in David's gaze made her want to believe. Something in him made her want to reach for the dreams she'd pushed down for so long. And for the first time in ages, she thought, maybe, just maybe. Chapter 3: The Unexpected Bond. The first few days felt like a blur. Julia wasn't sure what had happened. One minute she was serving coffee at a diner, living a life that seemed like it would never change. The next minute, she was walking through the sleek, marble-floored lobby of Hawthorne Capital, her heart pounding as she prepared for her first day as an executive assistant. The building was intimidating, towering over her with glass windows that gleamed under the afternoon sun. It felt like something out of a movie, a world she'd never thought she would be part of. Her hands shook as she adjusted her skirt, trying to seem more confident than she felt. The receptionist greeted her with a polite smile, directing her to the elevator. She stepped inside, feeling the weight of the moment settle into her chest. Her stomach churned with nerves, but underneath it all was something else, something unfamiliar. Hope. But what really unsettled her was that, even though she was standing at the entrance to a world of luxury and high status, part of her still couldn't stop thinking about David. She hadn't expected him to be so persistent, so sure about her potential. After their last conversation, she couldn't help but replay every word he'd said. He'd looked at her as if he saw something more than just the tired waitress struggling to get by. And for the first time in ages, she wondered if maybe he was right. Maybe she could do more. But that didn't mean she had to like him. She didn't trust him, not yet. No one could just waltz in and change the course of her life without expecting something in return. When she stepped off the elevator and into the office, she was greeted by Claire, the senior assistant. Claire was professional, poised, and clearly in control of everything around her. Julia felt a twinge of envy at her calm demeanor, wondering if she'd ever feel that self-assured. "You're with me for the day," Claire said, leading her toward David's office. "Don't worry about a thing. Just follow my lead and you'll be fine." Julia nodded, trying to shake the nervous energy buzzing through her body. The closer they got to the office, the more she realized how out of place she felt. This was a world where every detail was perfect. The polished floors, the expensive-looking art on the walls, the quiet hum of efficiency in the air. It was all so controlled, so different from the life she was used to. When they reached the door to David's office, Claire knocked lightly before pushing it open. David looked up from his desk, his sharp eyes meeting hers with that quiet intensity that still unsettled her. He was wearing a tailored suit, his sleeves rolled up slightly, showing the muscular arms that always seemed to draw attention. But it wasn't his appearance that held her attention now. It was the way he stood, tall, confident, and with an ease that spoke volumes of the life he had built for himself. "Julia," he greeted, his voice warm but businesslike. "I'm glad you made it." Her pulse quickened. She didn't know why, but she hated how comfortable she felt in his presence. She wasn't supposed to feel comfortable with him. He was a man who could change her life on a whim, a man who had offered her a chance to escape her reality. But he was also the same man who had a world of wealth and power she'd never known. That kind of life wasn't hers to claim. "Thank you," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. David gestured toward the seat in front of his desk, and she hesitated for only a moment before sitting down. His office was immaculate, the glass walls offering a stunning view of the city's skyline. The space felt like it was designed to intimidate, and yet, somehow, it didn't. It just felt cold. "Claire will be showing you the ropes today," David continued, his eyes never leaving hers. "You're here because I think you can bring something new to the team." Something new? Julia had no idea what that meant, but the compliment, however subtle, made her heart flutter. Could she really make a difference here? She wanted to tell him she didn't belong. She wanted to ask him why he'd chosen her over anyone else, but instead she nodded quietly, trying to absorb the overwhelming feeling of being thrust into a world she didn't understand. Claire, noticing the tension in the air, quickly took over the conversation, guiding Julia through the day-to-day responsibilities she would need to handle. But even as Claire spoke, Julia couldn't shake the feeling that David's eyes were still on her. He was watching her in a way that made her feel like she was a puzzle he was trying to solve. When the day was over, Julia found herself standing in the lobby, clutching her purse tightly, her mind swirling with thoughts of everything that had happened. How had she ended up here? She thought about her mom, sitting alone in their small apartment, waiting for a phone call. She thought about the job she'd left behind, the life she'd walked away from. And she thought about David, the man who had turned her world upside down. There was something about him that made her feel seen. Not in the way the world saw her, the tired waitress with her back bent under the weight of her responsibilities, but in the way he saw something more, something buried deep inside her. And it scared her. She hadn't expected to find anything in this job, but she was beginning to realize she had found him, the man who would change everything. Chapter 4. The truth comes crashing down. The morning air was sharp as Julia stepped out of the subway station, her breath fogging in the cool autumn air. It had been 2 weeks since she started working at Hawthorne Capital, and each day felt like she was walking deeper into a world she didn't belong to. The high-rising buildings towered over her, their glass facades glimmering in the early light, but nothing felt real anymore. She barely recognized herself. Gone were the days of rushing to a second-rate diner, working shifts just to get by. Now she wore suits that didn't fit quite right, and heels that pinched her feet with every step. She was playing a part in a world that wasn't hers. A world of polished floors, tailored suits, and boardrooms where her voice barely mattered. But David had noticed her. He'd seen something in her that no one else had. Or at least, that's what she told herself. And for a while, it felt like maybe, just maybe, she was meant to be here. She felt a sense of purpose she'd never known. Her tasks weren't glamorous, but they mattered. She was beginning to make an impact. The morning felt different, though. There was a restlessness in the air, a feeling she couldn't shake. She'd been in the office only an hour when she overheard a conversation that made her stomach drop. "Have you heard? They say David's planning to make some big changes soon," one of the other assistants was saying to Claire, their voices hushed but not quiet enough. "Yeah," Claire responded. "I heard he's been talking to the board about merging the company with another firm. A lot of people are nervous. They say he's been making all these decisions on his own. No consultation with the team." Julia froze, her breath catching in her throat. David? The man who had seemed so compassionate, who had seen potential in her, who had offered her a job when no one else had even looked her way? He was making decisions without consulting anyone? Was that who he really was? Before she could process the wave of emotions crashing over her, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced down at the screen. David L. Hawthorne. Meeting with board. 11 o'clock a.m. Julia's heart skipped. A meeting? She knew what that meant. David had been acting strange lately, but she hadn't thought much of it. He was always so composed, so in control. But now, she couldn't help but feel the undercurrent of something off. She opened the door to his office, her hand trembling slightly. As always, David was standing at the window, his back to her, looking out over the city. He didn't turn when she entered, didn't acknowledge her at first. "Good morning," she said quietly. David finally turned to face her, a smile tugging at his lips. "Morning, Julia. How's your day going?" Something in his voice caught her off guard. It wasn't the usual warmth she had come to expect. It was distant, like a carefully constructed mask he had put on for her benefit. "I overheard some things," Julia said, keeping her voice steady. "People are saying you're making changes, big decisions, without letting anyone know." His expression flickered for a moment, his gaze tightening. "Julia, you know how it is. The higher you go, the more decisions need to be made in private. You don't want to rush things." But Julia wasn't convinced. Her gaze hardened, her thoughts racing. "So you're telling me that everything's fine? No one else needs to be included?" David didn't respond right away. Instead, he walked to his desk, picking up a file. When he spoke again, his voice was measured. "I'm doing what I think is best for the company." "You don't think it's worth consulting the people who actually work here?" she asked, frustration building in her chest. David's eyes narrowed slightly. "I'm the CEO, Julia. I have the bigger picture in mind." She felt a pang in her chest, a sharpness she couldn't ignore. "You have the bigger picture? You mean your picture?" David stepped toward her, his face hardening. "Don't get emotional about this." His words hit like a slap. Emotional? How dare he accuse her of that? She wasn't being emotional, she was angry. She was angry because she had trusted him, believed in him when no one else had. And now, she was beginning to see that he was just like everyone else. "No, David," she said, her voice low, steady. "I'm not emotional. I'm disappointed. I thought you were different." He blinked, a flicker of something in his eyes. Guilt? Regret? But it was gone as quickly as it came. "Julia, this isn't what you think it is. I've worked too hard to get here. I can't afford to let things slip." "I don't care about your position," she snapped, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I don't care about your empire. What I care about is you. And I don't even know who you are anymore." David's jaw clenched, his eyes hardening into a mask of indifference. "This isn't the time for this conversation." But Julia couldn't stop. She couldn't ignore the rising anger in her chest, the feeling of betrayal that churned in her stomach. "I was just a pawn to you, wasn't I? You made me believe in you in this life. And now I'm realizing it was all a game." David's face went pale, the expression on his face shifting for just a moment. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Julia took a step back, the tears threatening to fall, but she held them back, forcing herself to stay strong. "I can't do this anymore, David. I can't keep pretending that everything is okay when it's not." She turned, her heart breaking, and walked out of his office. Chapter 5. A New Opportunity. It had been 5 days since Julia walked out of David's office. 5 days since she had looked him in the eyes and told him she couldn't do this anymore. And not a single word from him since. She'd half expected him to show up at her apartment that night, half hoped he would call or email or even send someone else to speak on his behalf, the way powerful men often do when they're too proud to admit they've made a mistake. But there was nothing, just silence. Julia wasn't sure if that hurt more than the betrayal itself. Now she was back where she started. Almost. Not at the diner, but in her old neighborhood, wearing thrift store jeans and standing in line at a local job fair that smelled like stale coffee and overused carpet. A woman ahead of her cradled a sleeping baby while filling out a form with one hand. A teenaged boy with acne and a resume folded into eighths stood behind her, bouncing on his heels. It felt surreal, like the past few weeks hadn't even happened. But they had. She had been in a skyscraper. She had sat across from a CEO. She had written memos that influenced real decisions, held meetings, spoken up, mattered. Now she was just another girl looking for a break. She clutched her resume tighter, the edges already curling. Maybe this was her punishment, for daring to dream above her station, for letting herself believe that someone like David, someone with wealth, power, and the world at his feet, could see her as more than a distraction. Then her phone buzzed. At first she ignored it, but it buzzed again, and again. Ah! When she finally checked the screen, her breath caught. An unknown number. "Please meet me, just 10 minutes, I won't ask for more than that. D." Her pulse quickened. She stared at the message as the line moved forward. She didn't reply. But she didn't delete it either. She found herself at the edge of Lincoln Park, standing beneath the elm tree where the grass always seemed a little greener. It was the same place her father used to bring her as a child, back when things were simpler, before he left. The wind tugged at her hair. She didn't know what she was expecting, but when David appeared from the walking path, it still made her heart lurch. He wasn't in a suit, not this time. Just a soft gray sweater and dark jeans. He looked human, tired, like someone who hadn't slept much. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "I didn't think you'd come," he said quietly. "I almost didn't," she replied. A breeze passed between them. David stepped closer, but not too close. He seemed to understand now. Space mattered. "I owe you an apology," he said. "Not just for the secrets, for everything." Julia's voice was calm, but firm. "Why didn't you tell me who you really were?" David exhaled. "Because I was tired of being that man, the man everyone wanted something from, the man who was only valuable when he was in a suit writing checks. He looked down at his hands, then back up at her. When you found me, that day on the street, I wasn't pretending to be poor. I'd been missing for 2 weeks. I'd shut off everything. I didn't want to be found. Julia's brow furrowed. You ran away? I broke, he said, without shame. I'd just lost my father. The board wanted to replace me. There were lawsuits, power grabs. I felt like I couldn't breathe. So I disappeared. For real. She stared at him, trying to match the man in front of her with the one from the glass tower. I thought you were just observing, playing a part. I was surviving, he said softly. And then you showed up. You gave me a sandwich and didn't ask for anything. You didn't see a CEO, you saw me. Her throat tightened. She didn't know what to say. David stepped a little closer. When I saw you again at the diner, I thought it was fate. I should have told you the truth then, but I was scared you'd leave. And I wasn't ready to be that man again, the one who's always hiding behind power. Silence stretched between them. Finally, Julia spoke. You should have trusted me. I know, he said, and I'm trying to earn that now. He pulled something from his pocket, a small folder. She hesitated before taking it. Inside were papers, a new job offer, but not for an assistant. It was for a partnership, creative development in a new charitable foundation under Hawthorne Capital's umbrella. Something he was starting. Something real. Why me? She whispered. David met her eyes. Because you see the world differently. Because you've been where people struggle. Because you've lived the life this foundation is trying to help. And because I need someone beside me who tells the truth, even when it hurts. Julia looked down at the papers again, her heart pounding. I'm not sure I can work with someone I don't trust, she said carefully. David nodded, accepting her words without protest. Then let me prove myself, he said. You don't have to forgive me yet, just let me start over. With you, with everything. Julia folded the folder and tucked it under her arm. I'll think about it, she said. And for the first time in days, she meant it. Chapter 6. The Test of Trust. The air inside Hawthorne Capital felt different now. Julia had made her decision. She was going to give it a chance, the job, the opportunity to work alongside David, to build something she'd only ever dreamed of. She couldn't turn away from the possibility. Not now, not after everything. But the more time she spent in the offices, the more she realized just how much she had to prove. Every task felt like it was under a microscope, and she had no idea if she could keep up with the pace of it all. The expectations, the phone calls, the meetings where she was expected to speak up, to contribute. All of it was overwhelming. And then there was David. He was everywhere, of course, at the helm of everything, every decision, every email, every project. But despite his frequent presence, despite his insistence that she belonged in this world, there was something between them that felt fractured. He seemed to be constantly at arm's length, not because of his usual aloofness, but because something was missing. Trust. He had broken it. And now, as their paths intertwined more closely than ever, Julia couldn't ignore the weight of his silence. It was the 3rd week on the job when it happened. Julia had been working late again, her eyes sore from staring at spreadsheets and reports. She was huddled at her desk, sipping her 3rd cup of coffee for the day, when she overheard a conversation from the hallway that made her freeze. David's voice, deep and firm, carried through the open door. Make sure the board knows where we stand by Friday, he said. We'll move forward, no matter what. This merger is critical. Julia's heart skipped a beat. She had known there were talks about a merger, but she hadn't realized it was already this far along. Was this the decision that would change everything? Would this be the moment where she lost any chance of working at Hawthorne Capital on her own terms? She gathered her papers quickly, trying to act normal, to act like she wasn't shaking. But she couldn't keep the thought from running through her mind. He's making decisions without telling anyone. David had told her before that he was careful, that every move he made was strategic, but this felt different. It felt too secretive, too controlled. And then the door opened. David stepped inside her office, his usual composed demeanor in place, but something in his eyes seemed distant. "I need those reports by the end of the day, Julia," he said, his voice low, yet carrying the weight of the command. Julia looked up at him, trying to hide the storm of thoughts swirling in her head. "I was just getting them ready," she said quickly, her tone tighter than she intended. But David didn't seem to notice. He was already walking to the other side of the room, rifling through the files on the shelf. He glanced back at her, his brow furrowed in thought. "And the investor meeting? We need your suggestions for the presentation by tomorrow. I expect more than just basic feedback." The words stung more than they should have. He wasn't asking, he was demanding. And she couldn't ignore the fact that it felt more like a test that she was failing, and she didn't know why. "I'll have it ready," Julia replied, biting her lip. David turned to leave, but just before he reached the door he paused. His shoulders seemed to tense, as if he were debating something with himself. Then, without facing her directly, he said, "I trust you, Julia. Don't forget that." The words hit her like an unexpected slap, leaving a bitter taste in her mouth. Trust. It had been so long since someone had trusted her that she wasn't sure how to handle it. She didn't want his trust. Not when it felt like it came with strings attached. "Don't worry," she said, her voice stiff. "I won't let you down." David gave her a short nod and left. She sat there for a long while, the weight of his words hanging in the air, her mind racing with confusion and frustration. Trust. It wasn't something he had earned with her. Not yet. Not after everything? The next day, she arrived early to the office, determined to get everything in order. She would show him she could do this, that she was more than just a girl from a diner. The reports were stacked neatly in front of her. The presentation was lined up. She was ready. Then, just before the meeting with the investors started, David entered the conference room, his usual confident stride bringing a sudden hush to the room. Julia stood, her heart pounding as she watched him. "You're not ready," he said quietly to her, scanning her face, and then turning his eyes to the screen. "I expected more, Julia." Her stomach twisted, a sense of humiliation flooding through her. The sharp words caught her off guard. What was he doing? Why was he trying to undermine her in front of everyone? She couldn't let him see her break. Julia squared her shoulders and held her ground. "I'll get it done. I'm not going to fail." David didn't reply, but his gaze softened for a fraction of a second, just enough for her to see the vulnerability he was trying to hide behind his facade. But why couldn't he be honest? It wasn't about the work, it wasn't about the presentations or the reports, it was about the walls he kept building between them, the emotional distance that only seemed to grow. Later that night, as she packed up her things, she found herself standing outside David's office, the door ajar. She could hear him speaking to someone on the phone. His voice was low, but it carried an undercurrent of frustration. "I need it to be done by the end of the week. I'll handle the investors. You just make sure it's settled," he said sharply, the edge of his tone cutting through the air. Julia took a step back, her heart sinking. She didn't know what he was hiding, but she had to know. The walls between them were too high. She couldn't stand to be part of his game any longer, not if she didn't understand the rules. Chapter 7. The Realization. The office was quiet when Julia arrived the next morning. It had been a restless night. The meeting with the investors had gone well enough, but the exchange with David lingered in her mind, like a conversation she hadn't been able to finish. His words about trust kept playing over and over in her head. "I trust you, Julia. Don't forget that." But trust wasn't something that was given freely, it had to be earned. And right now, she didn't feel like she could trust him at all. Not after everything. David's office door was closed, and the usually constant hum of the workplace felt muted today, as if the building itself was holding its breath. She set her purse down on her desk and took a deep breath, trying to shake the unease that had settled in her chest. The world outside the building felt so far away, like a life she used to know. A life that seemed so simple compared to the high-rising corridors of Hawthorne Capital. Just as she was about to begin working on the next report, the door to her office creaked open, and she looked up. David stood in the doorway, his figure silhouetted by the soft glow of the overhead lights. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, watching her. "David?" Julia's voice was calm, but she felt the weight of the moment hanging in the air between them. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. There was a quiet tension in the room now, different from the sharp exchanges they'd had before. This time, his usual air of confidence seemed to have evaporated, leaving behind something that was unfamiliar. "I owe you an explanation," he said quietly, his voice tinged with an emotion Julia hadn't heard before. "Guilt, maybe? Regret? I've been avoiding it. I didn't want to burden you with it, but I can't keep pretending like you don't deserve the truth." Julia felt her heart beat a little faster, but she didn't speak. She simply nodded, waiting for him to continue. David ran a hand through his hair, a rare moment of vulnerability showing. He looked almost lost, like he didn't quite know where to start. "When I asked you to join me, when I offered you this job, I didn't tell you everything." He began, his words slow and deliberate. "I wasn't just looking for someone to help me run things. I was looking for someone who could see past all the shit I've built." Julia's breath caught at the sharpness of his words. David met her gaze, his eyes sincere but shadowed. "You were the first person to treat me like I was a human being, not a CEO. When I disappeared for those weeks, I wasn't running from the company. I was running from myself." She frowned, confused. "Running from yourself?" He nodded, his jaw tight as he stepped closer. "I was lost, Julia. I'm not proud of it, but I wasn't just overwhelmed by the business. I was overwhelmed by who I had become. I let the company swallow me whole. I let the power, the wealth, the image of what people wanted me to be take over." His voice cracked slightly, and it made Julia's heart ache in a way she didn't expect. David, the powerful CEO, wasn't invincible. "I thought I was doing it for the right reasons, for my father, for the legacy, for the board, for the people who depended on me. But the truth is, I was just afraid that if I stopped, I would lose everything I'd worked for. And in the process, I lost myself." Julia swallowed, her emotions torn between anger and sympathy. This was the man she had admired, the man who had seemed untouchable, and now she was seeing the cracks in his armor, the vulnerability he had hidden so well. "So, you ran away?" she asked, her voice quieter now. "You thought you could just disappear and not face the consequences?" David's gaze softened. "I know I was wrong, but running was the only thing that made sense at the time. And then you saw me. Not as the CEO, not as the man with the perfect life. You saw the person who was struggling, who didn't know what the hell he was doing anymore." Julia blinked, her heart heavy with the weight of his confession. She had known something was wrong. She had known that David wasn't just a cold, calculating businessman, but hearing it from him, seeing the guilt and the raw honesty in his eyes, changed everything. She shook her head, her voice trembling slightly. "I didn't see anything. I just thought you needed help." "You gave me more than that," David said, his voice low. "You gave me a reason to stop running." Julia sat down, her legs feeling weaker than they had in days. A reason to stop running? She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected to feel pity for him, let alone understand why he had done what he had done. "But you didn't tell me who you were," she said, the frustration rising again. "You hid everything. You made me feel like I was just part of some game, and I—" She stopped herself, her hands clenched into fists. "I can't keep doing this. I can't keep being part of someone else's mess." David stepped forward, his eyes desperate now, searching hers for something. Forgiveness, understanding. "I'm not asking you to fix me," he said softly. "I'm asking you to trust me again. I know I don't deserve it, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to prove I can be someone worth trusting." For a long moment, Julia said nothing. The weight of his words hung between them, and she struggled to find a response. The truth was, she was torn. Torn between the man who had hurt her and the man who had offered her everything. Torn between the trust he had broken and the hope he had reignited. Finally, she looked up at him, her eyes steady but her voice soft. "I can't promise you anything, David. But I can't walk away either." David's shoulders relaxed for the first time in days. He nodded, as if the words she had said had made all the difference. "You don't have to," he said quietly. I'm just asking for a chance. Chapter 8. The Turning Point. It was an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of day that passed by unnoticed, filled with the usual tasks that now felt more like routine than purpose. But Julia couldn't shake the sense that something was off. The air was thick with an unspoken tension that seemed to follow her through the corridors of Hawthorne Capital, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. David had been distant lately, even colder than usual. His presence had become a looming shadow in her day, always just out of reach. They'd had moments of clarity, but this felt different. The things that had brought them together, the trust, the tentative friendship that had started to form, now seemed fragile, like glass teetering on the edge of breaking. As she sat at her desk, sorting through reports and answering emails, she couldn't help but glance at the clock. 11:45 a.m. David's office door was open, his silhouette visible through the glass. He was on the phone, speaking in low tones, his face unreadable. Julia had learned to read him over the last few weeks, but this time was different. There was an edge to his voice, a tightness around his eyes that she couldn't ignore. He had been like this all week, withdrawn, distracted, and she hated it. The sound of footsteps broke her reverie, and she looked up to find Claire, her colleague, standing at the entrance of the office. "Julia," Claire said, her tone businesslike but with an undertone of something more. "David wants to see you, right now." Julia's heart skipped a beat. She stood quickly, smoothing out her skirt and trying to steady her breath. "Thanks." She walked down the hall to his office, her steps measured but quick, each one carrying her closer to a confrontation she hadn't been prepared for. When she arrived, she knocked once before entering. David's office was the same as it always was, sleek, modern, and meticulously organized. He sat behind his desk, hands folded in front of him, his expression guarded. "Come in," he said, looking up from his laptop. Julia stepped inside, trying to keep her composure. "You wanted to see me?" David didn't immediately respond. Instead, he motioned for her to sit across from him. She did so, trying not to let the anxiety bubbling in her chest show. "I've been thinking about the future," David began, his voice low. "About everything we've talked about and everything that's been happening. I can't keep pretending like this is all just business." Julia blinked, confused by his words. "What do you mean?" David leaned forward, his gaze intense. "I think you know exactly what I mean." The room felt smaller suddenly, and the air between them thickened, as if the very space they occupied was closing in on them. "I'm not just your boss, Julia," he said, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "And you're not just my assistant. I've been trying to compartmentalize this, to keep things professional, but I can't anymore." Julia's heart hammered in her chest. Her mind raced, unsure whether she was ready to hear what she feared he was about to say. "You're right," she said quietly. "You can't. Not anymore." He didn't take his eyes off her. "I've been holding back, Julia. I thought I was protecting you. I thought if I kept things professional, kept my distance, that it would be easier. But it's not. It's not easy at all." Julia swallowed, her throat tight. "What are you trying to say, David?" David stood up from his desk, pacing a few steps before stopping. His hands rubbed together as if he were trying to dispel a sense of tension that had built in him too. "I think I'm falling in love with you." The words hit her like a wave. She had heard them from him before, in the quiet moments after meetings, in the way his eyes softened when he looked at her, but hearing him say them out loud, really say them, shook her to her core. "David," she started, her voice shaking. I can't. "I know it's complicated. I know it's messy," he interrupted, his voice rising slightly with the intensity of his confession. "But I can't keep pretending that I don't feel it, that I don't want more with you than this." Julia stood up, suddenly feeling the weight of everything they'd been through. "You're the CEO. You can't just expect everything to fall into place because you say so. This is real life, David. I can't keep living in your shadow. I can't keep living in the gray area between being your assistant and something more." David's expression softened, but there was still something unspoken hanging between them. "I don't expect it to be easy, but I'm not asking for perfection. I'm asking for a chance. A real chance. With you. She took a deep breath, the fight in her subsiding as she looked into his eyes. The eyes of a man who had spent so much of his life hiding, pretending, and running from who he really was. But she could see it now. The raw vulnerability in him. The part that wanted something genuine. Her heart ached, and she closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady herself. "I don't know if I can trust you again, David," she whispered. "Not after everything." "I understand," he said quietly. "But I'm willing to show you. I'm willing to earn that trust, one step at a time." She looked up at him, her chest tight with the weight of his words. She didn't know what the future held or if they could ever make this work, but for the first time she felt like she could take a step forward. She didn't know where it would lead, but she wasn't ready to walk away from him. Not yet. "Okay," she said finally, her voice small but steady. "One step at a time." David's face softened into a smile, the tension easing between them as he nodded. "Thank you." For the first time, Julia felt like she was standing on solid ground. She didn't know if they could ever be what they both needed, but maybe, just maybe, they could try. Chapter 9. The Confrontation. The air in the office had never felt so heavy, so thick with unspoken words and unanswered questions. Julia sat at her desk, her fingers frozen over the keyboard as she stared at the screen, but her mind was 1,000 miles away. She had never imagined that working here, in Hawthorne Capital, would be like this. So full of expectation, so full of questions, she didn't know how to answer. The weeks had passed since their last conversation, since the day David had confessed that he was falling in love with her. It wasn't just the words that stuck with her, it was the weight of them, the implication of what it meant. And yet, every day she had walked into the office, pretending like nothing had changed. She focused on the reports, the meetings, the presentations. She threw herself into the work as if it was the only thing that mattered, as if it could drown out the ache that had started to take root in her chest. But every day, David was there, watching her, waiting for something she wasn't sure she was ready to give. It was the late afternoon when it happened. The building was quieter now, the hum of the air conditioning the only sound in the halls. Julia was wrapping up the final details on a presentation for the next round of investors when she felt a presence at her door. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. "Julia." The way he said her name sent a shiver down her spine, like it had the power to undo everything she had built inside herself. She took a deep breath, keeping her eyes on her screen. "What is it, David?" He didn't answer right away. She could feel him standing there, the weight of his gaze making her pulse quicken. Slowly, she turned her chair around, facing him. David stood there, tall and imposing, his usual confident demeanor now laced with something else. Uncertainty. But there was a determination in his eyes, something that felt different from before. "We need to talk," he said, his voice steady but quiet. Julia's heart skipped a beat. She knew what this was about. She had been waiting for it, dreading it. The moment when the walls they had built around each other would come crashing down. "I don't think we have anything left to say," she replied, her voice shaking despite her attempt to remain calm. "You said what you needed to say, David. And I've listened. I've thought about it, but I can't keep pretending that everything is fine. I can't keep pretending that this is just business." David's expression softened, his jaw tightening, as if he were holding back something he didn't know how to say. "I've been trying to find a way to prove it to you," he said, his voice quiet, but the pain was clear in every word. "But I've been going about it all wrong. I pushed you away because I was afraid. Afraid of what this would mean. Afraid of being vulnerable. Afraid of losing you." Julia swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath. "You've always been afraid, David. But you didn't just push me away. You shut me out. You lied to me. You kept me in the dark, and I can't live like that, not anymore." David stepped forward, his eyes searching hers with a quiet intensity that made her heart ache. "I never meant to hurt you," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "But I was trying to protect myself, and in doing that, I pushed you away. I didn't think it would hurt this much. I didn't think I'd lose you." Julia stood up from her desk, her body trembling with the weight of everything she had been holding inside. The anger, the frustration, the heartbreak. It all poured out in a single breath. "You don't get it, David," she said, her voice rising now, no longer steady. "I trusted you. I trusted you when no one else did. And you," she paused, trying to control the surge of emotion threatening to take over. "You took advantage of that trust. You kept secrets from me, and now you want me to just forgive you? You want me to forget that you're the one who broke everything between us?" David's face crumpled in pain, but he didn't look away. "No, I don't want you to forgive me. I don't even deserve your forgiveness." He stepped closer to her, his hands trembling at his sides. "I'm just asking for a chance to fix it. I don't want to keep running from this. I don't want to keep hiding behind my power, my wealth, my job. I just want you. I need you, Julia." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with everything they both knew but hadn't dared to speak. Julia took a step back, her chest tight with the force of everything she was feeling. "I don't know if I can trust you again," she whispered, her voice breaking under the weight of her own words. "I don't know if I can ever look at you the way I did before. Because everything's changed. I've changed." David's face fell, the vulnerability in his eyes undeniable. "I understand, but I can't let you go without trying, without showing you that I'm not the same man I was before." Julia shook her head, the ache in her chest growing unbearable. "I don't know what you want from me, David. I don't know how to make this work. I don't know if we can fix what's broken." David reached out, his hand trembling as he gently cupped her face, his touch soft and tentative. "I don't know if we can fix it either, but I'm not giving up on us. Not yet." Her heart raced in her chest, the silence between them thick with the weight of what they had said and what they hadn't. Julia stood still for a moment, her breath shallow, her thoughts in chaos, but then, slowly, she reached up and placed her hand over his, feeling the warmth of his skin against hers. "David," she said softly, the words slipping out like a confession. "I'm scared. I'm scared of getting hurt again." "I know," he said, his voice low and steady. "But you don't have to be alone in this. Not anymore. I'll fight for you, Julia. For us." And in that moment, with his hand against her cheek and the vulnerability in his eyes, Julia finally saw the man behind the mask. Not just the CEO, but the man who had once been lost. The man who had shown up against all odds, asking for a chance. Maybe it wasn't too late to take it. Chapter 10. The New Beginning. The morning sun shone through the office windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor of Hawthorne Capital's lobby. But it was the warmth of the moment, not the sunlight, that made Julia's heart race. It had been 2 weeks since the confrontation, 2 weeks since she had finally let herself face what she had been denying. The truth. David had given her the space she needed to decide, and while the tension between them had eased, the uncertainty of the future still loomed. But today felt different. The board meeting was over, and the deal was closed. The investors had signed on, and everything had fallen into place, just like David had predicted. He stood in the middle of the office now, making quick decisions, talking to executives, moving with the grace and assurance of someone who was finally back where he belonged. But there was something in his eyes that had changed. Julia watched him for a moment, taking in the way he moved with purpose, but also the way he looked at her now. Not as his assistant, not as someone beneath him, but as an equal. She hadn't been sure if she could ever get past the pain, the betrayal, the secrecy. But every day, with each quiet conversation and subtle gesture, David had proved himself. Slowly but surely, he had earned her trust back. And she had found herself falling not just for the man he showed the world, but for the man he had allowed her to see behind the mask. Julia stood up from her desk, smoothing down the edges of her blouse, her heart racing. Today she was going to make a choice that would change everything. The elevator doors opened, and she stepped inside, the cool metal walls reflecting her image as she glanced at herself in the mirrored surface. "Ready," she whispered the word to herself, her breath steadying as the elevator began its ascent. When the doors opened on the executive floor, she was met with the familiar hum of productivity, but something felt different today. There was a calmness in the air, a quiet anticipation. As she walked toward David's office, she saw him standing at the window, his back to her, His posture was relaxed, but there was a hint of something, vulnerability maybe, that Julia hadn't seen before. She stopped in the doorway, watching him for a moment, unsure if she should interrupt. But before she could speak, he turned, his gaze locking onto hers with that quiet intensity she had come to know so well. "Julia," he said softly, his voice full of something she couldn't quite place. "I was just about to call you in." She stepped into the room, her heart pounding as she took a deep breath. The space between them felt smaller now, less daunting. "I know we've been through a lot," she began, her voice steady but soft. "And I know I've been difficult. I've questioned everything, and I didn't make it easy for you, for us." David nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. He stepped closer, but not too close, as if giving her space to speak her truth. "David," she continued, "I'm not perfect. I've made mistakes too. And I've held on to my own fears, my own doubts. But in the last 2 weeks, I've realized something. I can't keep running. Not from this, not from you." He stepped forward, his expression softening, but Julia held up her hand before he could speak. "I'm not saying it's all fixed. I'm not saying I'm not scared. But I'm saying I'm ready. Ready to take the next step with you, without holding back." David's gaze softened, and for a moment, it was like everything else in the world disappeared. There was no boardroom, no power struggles, no past mistakes. Just them. "You're willing to trust me again?" he asked, his voice low. She smiled softly, the uncertainty still there but now laced with something stronger. "Yes, but it has to be different. No more secrets, no more games." David nodded, his eyes steady. "I promise, no more secrets, no more running." He reached for her hand then, his touch gentle but sure. "Julia, I've been waiting for this. For us. For so long. And I know it's not going to be easy, but I'll never give up on us. I'll never give up on you." Julia squeezed his hand, her heart racing as she looked into his eyes. For the first time in a long time, she felt like they were both on the same page. She wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't running anymore. And for the first time, she realized that love, real love, wasn't about the perfect moments. It was about the messy, imperfect ones that brought you closer. "I'm not perfect, David," she whispered, "but I'm willing to try. For you. For us." David's smile was slow, almost hesitant, but when he spoke, it was filled with a quiet certainty she had come to trust. "I'll take that." They stood there, their hands still clasped, their futures uncertain, but shared. And for the first time, Julia allowed herself to believe that this messy, imperfect love might just be everything she needed. "Conceal you." The sun dipped low in the sky as Julia sat by the window in her small, cozy apartment, the light filtering through the curtains like a gentle reminder of the new chapter she was beginning. She smiled softly to herself, her fingers gently tracing the edges of the papers on her desk. It was the same desk where she had once sat, feeling like the weight of the world rested on her shoulders. But now there was a lightness in her chest, a quiet peace. Life had a way of surprising you. It had surprised her more times than she could count. From the moment she had met David, the man who had been both a stranger and someone she thought she knew, everything had changed. She had started out just trying to survive, struggling to make ends meet, holding on to the scraps of a life that didn't feel like it belonged to her. But somewhere along the way, she had discovered something more, her own strength, her own worth. And it hadn't come from the job at Hawthorne Capital or from the chance at a lavish life. It had come from the decision to trust herself, to believe in the love she was capable of giving, and to take a chance on David. Despite the doubts, despite the fear. And it wasn't just about love. It was about the courage to be vulnerable, to admit that we all make mistakes, and that sometimes the greatest act of strength is to ask for forgiveness, to own your imperfections. It was about choosing to build something together, not on illusions, but on truth. Julia had learned that love was never going to be perfect. It wasn't about the grand gestures or the fairy tale moments. It was about the messy, beautiful reality of two people deciding to make the choice every day to show up for each other. David had changed too. He had gone from the cold, guarded CEO to a man who was willing to open up, to show his vulnerabilities. He had given her space when she needed it, but he had also fought for her, for them, when it mattered most. They had both done the hard work of rebuilding, not just their careers, not just their future, but their trust in each other, their belief in true partnership. They knew it wasn't going to be easy, but that was the point. It wasn't about avoiding the pain. It was about facing it together, with the understanding that their bond was stronger than the obstacles in their path. Julia glanced at the clock. It was almost time for her meeting with the team. A small smile tugged at the corner of her lips as she picked up her coffee mug. The cafe down the street was now her new favorite spot, where she met with her team and brainstormed ideas for the charitable foundation she and David had started together. The same foundation that had once been a distant dream. As she sipped her coffee, she thought about the journey, the ups, the downs, the tears, the laughter, the moments that had tested her and had ultimately shaped who she was becoming. This was her life now. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't without its challenges, but it was hers. And as the world continued to turn around her, Julia knew one thing with absolute certainty. She had found a place where she finally felt seen. Not as an assistant, not as someone's daughter, but as a woman who had everything she had worked for, and a man beside her who understood what it meant to love, even in the mess of it all. Sometimes we find ourselves standing at the crossroads of uncertainty, unsure of which direction to take. Whether in love, work, or life, it's easy to forget the power we hold to choose our own path. But maybe the most important lesson we can learn is this. The real luxury in life is having someone to share the silence with. Someone who sees us, understands us, and chooses to stay, no matter how imperfect we are. What's your story? Have you found the courage to trust again or to take a leap of faith even when the future feels uncertain? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and remember, the best part of every journey is the chance to start again. If you're inspired by Julia and David's story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more heartfelt stories that remind us that love, no matter how complicated, is always worth the fight. The sun dipped low in the sky as Julia sat by the window in her small, cozy apartment, the light filtering through the curtains like a gentle reminder of the new chapter she was beginning. She smiled softly to herself, her fingers gently tracing the edges of the papers on her desk. It was the same desk where she had once sat, feeling like the weight of the world rested on her shoulders. But now, there was a lightness in her chest, a quiet peace. Life had a way of surprising you. It had surprised her more times than she could count. From the moment she had met David, the man who had been both a stranger and someone she thought she knew, everything had changed. She had started out just trying to survive, struggling to make ends meet, holding on to the scraps of a life that didn't feel like it belonged to her. But somewhere along the way, she had discovered something more, her own strength, her own worth. And it hadn't come from the job at Hawthorne Capital or from the chance at a lavish life. It had come from the decision to trust herself, to believe in the love she was capable of giving, and to take a chance on David, despite the doubts, despite the fear. And it wasn't just about love. It was about the courage to be vulnerable, to admit that we all make mistakes, and that sometimes the greatest act of strength is to ask for forgiveness, to own your imperfections. It was about choosing to build something together, not on illusions, but on truth. Julia had learned that love was never going to be perfect. It wasn't about the grand gestures or the fairy tale moments. It was about the messy, beautiful reality of two people deciding to make the choice every day to show up for each other. David had changed too. He had gone from the cold, guarded CEO to a man who was willing to open up, to show his vulnerabilities. He had given her space when she needed it, but he had also fought for her, for them, when it mattered most. They had both done the hard work of rebuilding, not just their careers, not just their future, but their trust in each other, their belief in true partnership. They knew it wasn't going to be easy, but that was the point. It wasn't about avoiding the pain. It was about facing it together, with the understanding that their bond was stronger than the obstacles in their path. Julia glanced at the clock. It was almost time for her meeting with the team. A small smile tugged at the corner of her lips as she picked up her coffee mug. The cafe down the street was now her new favorite spot, where she met with her team and brainstormed ideas for the charitable foundation she and David had started together. The same foundation that had once been a distant dream. As she sipped her coffee, she thought about the journey, the ups, the downs, the tears, the laughter, the moments that had tested her and had ultimately shaped who she was becoming. This was her life now. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't without its challenges, but it was hers. And as the world continued to turn around her, Julia knew one thing with absolute certainty. She had found a place where she finally felt seen. Not as an assistant, not as someone's daughter, but as a woman who had everything she had worked for, and a man beside her who understood what it meant to love, even in the mess of it all. Sometimes we find ourselves standing at the crossroads of uncertainty, unsure of which direction to take. Whether in love, work, or life, it's easy to forget the power we hold to choose our own path. But maybe the most important lesson we can learn is this: the real luxury in life is having someone to share the silence with. Someone who sees us, understands us, and chooses to stay, no matter how imperfect we are. What's your story? Have you found the courage to trust again, or to take a leap of faith even when the future feels uncertain? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and remember, the best part of every journey is the chance to start again. If you're inspired by Julia and David's story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more heartfelt stories that remind us that love, no matter how complicated, is always worth the fight.